Yeah, so many of you will know, I think, if you know me personally, or if you've heard some of my previous talks on TGIF, that my interests do lie in the New Testament, the Gospels particularly, and specifically the formation of the Gospels, what is called Gospel origins. So I find myself often just reading there, and I was fortunate to have a daughter that came back from the UK, and it's always cheaper if you buy books in other places of the world and you get sort of a book mule to bring them. My earlier book mule was in actual fact Kelly, but she hasn't been visiting me enough, so now I have to get my daughter to bring books. So I had some exciting stuff that I was reading that fits into some of the things that I've shared with you before. So here's some history and maybe some technical background. If it doesn't interest you, stick with me. It does get a little bit more interesting. So most scholars and pastors would agree that I think the majority view, if I can put it like that, is that our first gospel was the Gospel of Mark. Mark was the first evangelist to compose what we know as a gospel. Early church tradition tells us that he composed his gospel from the preaching of Peter. He was a follower of Peter, and Papias and others. Some of the early church fathers talk about the fact that he then, either through Peter or the church, was asked then to write down what he knew, possibly at the time of the martyrdom of Peter in Rome. So shortly afterwards, Luke probably, and then Matthew followed suit, but Mark was the first one to establish this template. There's been a lot of writings around that, the latest one by Craig Keener, and saying that Mark didn't use it, he didn't create a new genre. He used an existing genre of the Greek bios. And again, I won't go into that this morning, but talking about historical or famous figures. So he used that genre, which is quite important to us, as I've been understanding it now. But in effect, it became a new genre. As I said, before then, there was no such thing as a gospel. So there was a Greek bios, but there was a gospel. And since then, we have our canonical gospels and then many others. But it's still exciting to think that before Mark, there was no such thing as a gospel, which we so cherish and have with us today. So as I said, I think Luke and then Matthew and then later John followed suit, and so did some others. But those that were retained as part of the canon of Scripture, as we call it, were these: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Luke, and Mark are what is known as the Synoptic Gospels because they more closely relate to one another in terms of the material and the outline and the timeline and things like that. So some of the stuff that fascinates me is if we think of it and we say, well, if Mark was first and Luke and Matthew wrote after Mark, what did Luke and Matthew use as their sources? And it seems very, very clear that that all the gospel writers, everyone subsequent to Mark, used Mark as a template, what some scholars later referred to as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. I don't think does justice to the Gospels, but certainly that's the word I like to use, the template that was created. So Luke and Matthew differed from Mark in the fact that they added a substantial amount of material, particularly teaching material. You can think of the Sermon on the Mount, even the parables. And at just a cursory reading, if you've, even if you just look at the length of them in your Bible, there is far more detail and substance to what Mark had used. And as I said, the majority of the material is in fact teaching. So here's a short transition just to show you, as I said, the majority view. We're not going to spend the whole day giving you some of the other theories on this. But Luke first used Mark, and Matthew used Mark as well. That transition didn't work as well as I wanted it to. But then Matthew and Luke, with this substantial amount of teaching, used another source. And they obviously found their material from elsewhere. And it's quite easy to see in some places, particularly if you look at the Greek, that in certain places, the wording, the phrasing is identical. So it is quite obvious that they had a different source. And it is quite probable that there was a written source. And scholars have eventually called this source what they call Q, or Quelle, which came from some of the German scholars that worked around us. So just to say that there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of furor surrounding that. Does that document actually exist? Was it one document? Was it a series of documents? Some more conservative scholars would just discount it completely. And while on the other hand, some more historical academics and that have dedicated their life not just to the study of Q, but in fact the compilation of Q, particularly Kloppenberg there. I mean, they have actually come up with what they see as the critical edition of Q. Some of the, I think, incredible scholars that I follow, two of them being James Dunn and Martin Hengel, are quite convinced as to the existence of Q. Dunn is far more nuanced, and a lot of the talks I've done before, Dunn talks about just the critical importance of the oral tradition. So while Dunn says he does believe that such a document existed, a lot of that common material, that common source, can in actual fact be attributed to just the oral transmission of the apostles and the first followers of Jesus sharing the stories. But again, at points, you have to say that that Luke and Matthew have copied identically from a text, and therefore Dunn and others would say, no, definitely there must have been some written source. But as I say, I think Dunn is far more exciting and creative about this, just in terms of how he holds the oral tradition and what could be a written source, multiple sources. Please don't tell me there is a automatic transition on this. This is going to be fun. Anyhow, so as I said, what we focus on in terms of this is in fact the fact that this material was teaching. It was Jesus, the teacher, and a lot of that teaching in actual fact is then referred to as the sayings source. So the teachings, the sayings of Jesus, but without the story. The quotable Jesus without the mess of stables, siblings, everyday life, and even death. So Q as a source was teachings, but just the sayings of Jesus. As I said, the quotable Jesus, not Jesus, there's no Jesus, just wandering off without his parents. No Jesus losing his temper with scribes and Pharisees, overturning tables in the temple or cursing a fig tree. There's none of that. Jesus is washed, sanitized, you could say ready for use in any situation. But here's the fascinating thing. Q never survived. We simply don't have it. That's the problem that most people have with Q. It's like, well, where is this? You know, it didn't come down through the history of the church. And so the question I ask in a very simplistic way, and I'm not a scholar of this in any way, but I go, well, maybe the church didn't need it. Those teachings, the parables, etc., the more extensive life and ministry of Jesus was retained to us through our sacred gospels, and the others were lost. So in a way, one could say, speaking from a more faith, inspiration of scripture point of view, say maybe the Holy Spirit didn't value it either. So there's a lot of discussion we could have then about much later, early 1900s, the Gospel of Thomas was found. And scholars got so excited because they said, here is evidence of Q, a gospel that was found, that is sayings, traditions, and certainly. So the Gospel of Thomas and the study of Q are important from a scholarly perspective, from a historical perspective. Many people will argue, well, the Gospel of Thomas is further credence to the Q hypothesis. Yet, the Gospels that the church treasured, what they copied, what they studied, what they memorized, what they lived and what they hid because they cherished it, was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So what we have in other hypotheses is not the history that was read, that was prayed, that was cherished, that was recited, even sung in the church, throughout the history of the church, since its inception. So why is that important? Why that whole long historical point about stuff that I love to read about? So the story of Jesus, the life and ministry of Christ, the Messiah, is revealed to us as story. It does not come to us primarily as teaching, but as narrative, story. And that has to be important to us. Jesus's words, his parables, his teachings, his sayings that scholars are so fixated on were never meant to be separated out from his life, from the way in which he lived. Jesus's words were never intended simply to be heard. It seems the meaning, the implication was they were to be lived. As a young rabbi, Jesus certainly called students. All the Gospels agree that he called disciples to himself. He was a teacher, but his words and his parables and his teachings were from the person, the unique person of Jesus. And his invitation to discipleship, in actual fact, is not like teaching and scholars and that we understand today. It was in a completely different world. People that gave their life to follow and emulate a rabbi. And we have many very humorous accounts of that throughout history. My favorite one is the young follower of a Jewish rabbi that hid under the rabbi's bed. And when him and his wife went to sleep, the rabbi found him under the bed and said to him, like, oh my word, what are you doing here? And the student was saying, well, Rabbi, I want to learn everything from you. So, yeah, we won't dwell on that anymore. But yeah, so we are quite happy today. Later in history, from the Enlightenment, maybe a bit earlier and onwards, we quite enjoy divorcing knowledge from life. We're happy to divorce teaching from character. And the Gospels just do not allow for that. They don't entertain that at all. So we live in an information age. We live in a world that values information over story. And never before in human history have we had so much information at our fingertips. Our world is a world of what is it, 280 characters. My daughter and I checked that last night because I think it started at 140 or something like that. The news that we prefer is sound bites, short clips, quotes, etc. We can't keep our attention for very long. I remember the other news story that I thought was quite humorous was just an account of some of the news agencies and that, and they said when there's nothing happening on the news, what they would do is they would phone Julius Malema for a quote. Just have something controversial, something that'll get your attention, something that'll sell, something, that we can just look at in 280 characters or whatever the format is. So Eugene Peterson, who I'm going to quote quite a lot and give you some of the sources of that a little bit later. Peterson was arguing how we are meant to digest the words of Scripture. In fact, he uses a long metaphor about a dog chewing a bone, particularly in his work on the Psalms. But he says this, he says, these words of Scripture, they have a different effect on us from those that come to us from outside, whether in the form of propaganda or information. Propaganda works another person's will upon us, attempting to manipulate us to an action or to a belief. And he says what propaganda creates is puppets. We become puppets. But then he goes on to say this. He says, there is no dignity. There's no soul in a puppet. And information reduces words to the condition of commodities that we can use however we will. Words are removed from their originating context in the moral universe and from personal relationships so that they can be used as tools, even weapons. Such commodification of language reduces both those who speak it and those who listen to it also as commodities. So maybe Q is testimony to the fact that from early on, even in the early church, people always wanted summaries. They always wanted quotes and disembodied teaching, even today. But as I said, it never survived, but the stories did. The interesting thing about particularly Matthew and Luke is how they start with their genealogies. So-and-so beget so-and-so, beget so-and-so, beget so-and-so. And if you're like me, for most of my life, you just go like, well, let's just move along. I have no idea what Matthew and Luke were doing in all of that. And later came to understand, okay, well, they had a point out of this, particularly Luke showing this Davidic line of Jesus. And so that's possibly all the meaning I can take out of that. It's important to show the genealogy of Jesus. But, surely Luke could have done that in one word. Jesus is a descendant of Adam, Abraham, and David. One sentence. He could have just said the whole thing. But he includes, they both do these heroes, some of the cool guys of Scripture, some of those with really good genes. And then he includes just a real bunch of nobodies, just ordinary people. All they did, it seems, is begat. It's like their contribution was to beget somebody else. I have a daughter that jokes with me about that, but I won't share that here. So, but what else do genealogies do? Well, they ground the story, or they ground Jesus in the story of Israel. They ground his life and ministry in history and in this grand narrative, God's plan for Israel, God's plan for the Messiah, and in actual fact, his plan for the whole world. And most of that is revealed to us as narrative. There are prophetic writings, there are psalms, there's apocalyptic literature, but most of it, even the prophets, most of it is narrative. It's story. So when I read the genealogies, and this is only subsequent to reading Peterson, or beginning to read him, I think I started reading him about 20 years ago. But what happens is that I read these genealogies and I say, well, how did those lame nobodies get in on the story? How do they find themselves in Jesus' story? And then it leaves me with the thought, well, can I get in on it? How do I get in on the Jesus story? So story invites participation. Any good story invites us in. And if you tell stories to children particularly, they always want to ask, where are we in the story? I have two adult girls, and we can tell stories about when my wife and I met, and when we first had children, and stories about, you know, silly things that they did, or bathing them, and whatever it is, as kids that they don't remember. And even as adults, they're mesmerized. They want to know, where am I in the story? And any good story has that effect on all of us. We say, where am I in the story? And that's what the Gospels do. The Gospels are meant, in actual fact, to be read in a way that says, how do I get in on this? Jesus invited people to follow him. Do you think I can follow him? So again, the Bible doesn't come as disembodied information. It is revealed. The very revelation, the form, is narrative. And it is a story that we are meant to participate in. And so this invites a different kind of reading, as it were. It requires prayerful, meditative, contemplative thought and engagement. And in fact, if we read the Gospels, the plain conclusion we come to is it requires entire life transformation. I remember one of the earlier talks at TGIF, even at Crested, Father Godfrey Henwood, who was the minister at St. Thomas's, and he did some talks for us at TGIF. He even spoke at our church for us, and he challenged me, and he had a wonderful phrase, and I've stolen it ever since, actually. But he said, when we read the Bible, we don't read for information. We read for transformation. And that has had a profound effect on me. So also just to say that when it comes to Easter and Christmas, and apologies to those from my congregation, they've heard this ad infinitum, but Peterson is brilliant on this. He says to pastors, he says the temptation when we come to these major events in the Christian year, particularly Christmas and Easter and a few others, he says the temptation to preachers is to say something new, to say something that is exciting, something that is novel. But he goes on to say that then we're missing the whole point. We are meant to read, and his word is rehearse these stories as we tell the story that everybody knows. As we read it again, as you know, sometimes you enact it, however, whatever your church tradition is, but as we share those same stories, we rehearse them. And as we rehearse them to find ourselves in the story. Another word, one of my favorites from Peterson is immerse. Immerse is a baptism word. It's a baptism image that we're familiar with. But Peterson says that we are called to immerse ourselves in the story of the Bible, the grand narrative from Genesis to Revelation. We are meant to plunge in and get wet. We are meant to literally be drowned in the story and to come out completely new, transformed. So if you read contemporary Christian authors and scholars and things like that, I think the really good ones love the whole story. They have a way of stirring us. They ignite our desire to read more, to read widely, and to read deeper. We can read one author, whoever it is, and as they reach into the prophets, into Exodus, into the Gospels, into Genesis, and they connect the dots, it stirs in us this desire. I want to read for myself. I want to immerse myself in this world and see all those connections and dots for myself. So I've mentioned this many times before, but N.T. Wright does that for me. N.T. Wright is brutal. He's like, you cannot read the Gospels without reading Isaiah, and all the other prophets, and the Exodus story, you have to, and Genesis, and there's David, and the way that he does that, he just draws you in. And again, I'm sure that there are many others that does that. Again, Eugene Peterson is another one. As you read Peterson, you have this metaphor to be immersed in the world of Scripture. And then Dallas Willard quoted extensively on this. And Dallas Willard is I mean, I listened to him in some seminars and met with him personally, and he's just awful, quite honestly. It's just brutal. He said to a colleague of mine, Alexander, I can out him here because I don't see him on this, but Alexander Fenter said to him at one point, he said, Dallas, in a, how he phrased this, I'm not sure, but in a desire to emulate him and become like him. He was like, Dallas, what are you reading? What can I read, to become, as learned and as just such a godly and incredible man that Dallas Willard was. So Dallas Willard turned around to him and said, and he always does this very thoughtfully, he said, Alexander, you should read the Gospels. And then you should read everything Paul wrote. And then, in fact, the rest of the New Testament and so on. And that was not only his honest answer, that was the conviction of his life. He had a seminar for vineyard pastors in the US. He said to them, why don't you read the New Testament in a week? He said, it's not long. Just sit down and read it in a week. I love the story. A friend of mine, many, many years ago when I entered ministry, he gave me a book of a collection that was Warren Wiersbe, Living with the Giants, a collection of biographies. And that was, again, just so challenging to me. I think it's Archibald Alexander, but Warren Wiersbe is telling these stories of different men and women throughout history. And a group of ministers, got together later in the day, and they were talking about what they read that morning. And again, like many of us, if someone said to me, what did I read this morning? As a joke to those at Hillside, it would be like Ephesians chapter 3, or, maybe you read Psalm 51 or something like that. And they turned to him and they said, well, what were your devotions this morning? And he said, Isaiah. And it just, again, it's not always possible, depending on your life and your schedule and something like that. But reading these and hearing these people, it challenges me. It challenges me to read more, to read widely, and in fact to just be drawn in and immersed into the story. So I have another long quote by Peterson, but let's see. Just my routine as a just simple suggestion that I could leave you with. I've tried various Bible reading programs over the years. A lot of them sort of suggest reading in about 4 different places. They say if you read about 4 chapters, you'll read the Bible in a year, that kind of thing. But one suggestion that I leave with you is a number of people have looked at if you just divide the Bible equally in terms of just quantity of portions. And there's a way that you can divide it into 5, which is far too confusing for me. And then there's a simple way in which you can divide the Bible into 3, Genesis, Job, and Matthew. And if you read, whether you read, 2 chapters a day or every other day from Genesis, or you read 5 chapters and then 5 from Job and 5 from Matthew, if you do that in sync, then you will end those 3 portions and finish the Bible at the same time. And so for me, that's become a little bit more helpful, because I don't like to just read a chapter out of one place and a chapter out of another place. I actually prefer to get involved in that story. So I use that outline, but sometimes I'm just reading Genesis and then I stop and then I pick up from Job and I, just read from there. So that is a suggestion. The other way that I do the Old Testament at times is I just listen to it on Audible. So I can be shaving and getting dressed in the morning. I'm fortunate to have one of these little earpieces, and I'll put it in and I'll just listen. And it's wonderful, because sometimes instead of my mind just wandering on other things and getting stressed about my day, I just listen to scripture. And to listen to it, if you have a commute in those days when you used to go to the office, and hopefully one day soon, it's wonderful just in actual fact to listen to the Bible. My wife and I, she got on Audible the Message Bible that you listen to in a year or something like that. And a couple of years ago, we listened to that. So you don't have to purchase the Message Bible or, one of the later translations. A lot of the stuff is just free. You just download it off the internet and you just take Genesis and dump it on your phone. And when you finished it, you load Exodus or whatever it is. So that would be, some of the suggestions that I would make. There was a joke about that. That was my Audible suggestion. I know Kelly loves listening to Audibles. And then those are just some sources I thought I would give to you. The 2 below are the same. I thought they were different works, but the first one, the one that I'm familiar with, that was actually in Qum for a long time, is by Bartholomew and Gohin, The Drama of Scripture. And the latest one, it actually only came out in December, was the one on the left, The True Story of the Bible, same authors. So those 2, and Alec Moccia, who I've been enjoying recently, very conservative, but sort of more conservative evangelical, if I can say it like that. He has a scenic route through the Old Testament, again, just helping sometimes connect the dots. And he has another work on, if you want to just see the Messiah through Scripture. So those are a couple that, if you're interested in some of that, I can leave with you. So I think there's time for one last quote. So the book that I find myself reading again is this one that you see on the screen. I listened to this on Audible. It wasn't on Audible, on audio, and it was abridged. It was actually his earlier lectures on this theme many, many years ago. And he then elaborated it and published it as part of his series on spiritual theology. So there's a couple of other books in this, excellent, incredible series. So just getting back to the kind of reading Just listen to what Peterson says. He says, I'm interested in cultivating this kind of reading, the only kind that is congruent for what is written in Holy Scripture. So just talking about the digesting, the chewing on the bone, a metaphor that he uses. And then, sorry, I'm going to pick up later. He says, all of these holy writers of Scripture, these authors that we find in the canon, they are all distinguished by a deep trust in the power of words to bring us into the presence of God and to change our lives. By keeping company with the writers of Holy Scripture, we are schooled in a practice of reading and writing that is infused with an enormous respect, more than respect, awed reverence for the revelatory and transformative power of words. The opening page of the Christian text for living, the Bible, tells us that the entire cosmos and every living creature in it are brought into being by words. St. John selects the term word to account, first and last, for what is most characteristic about Jesus, the person at the revealed and revealing center of the Christian story. Language, spoken and written, is the primary means for getting us in on what God is, what he's doing. But it is the language of a certain type, not words external to our lives, the sort used in grocery lists, computer manuals, French grammars, or basketball rule books. These are words intended, whether confrontationally or obliquely, to get inside of us, to deal with our souls, to form a life that is congruent with the world that God has created, the salvation that he has enacted, and the community that he has gathered. Such writing anticipates and counts on a certain kind of reading. Well, that's pretty much me for this morning. I'd like to just close, and well, it's really closing with that quote, but to say obviously what I haven't touched on at all this morning, and I'm sure Rechadi and others, Temba and many others would say, well, what about our African context? We live on a continent that still values story. And there are so many ways in which we can look at making this story of Scripture a story that attracts and invites conversation and participation today.
Hi. Thanks so much, Wayne. Yes, I've got some. I know where to set off from next week, but I mean, there's nothing controversial. But I think that maybe you could just say a little bit more. You talked at the end about story and Africa and so on, and not just Africa. All parts of the world have all got all sorts of tales and stories. But just a bit about, we're talking about the story of Jesus, but the way Jesus himself used story, because I think that's an important, a very important issue that perhaps we need to learn from. Maybe just a few thoughts on that.
Oh, but Temba, you're the one who should be answering that question. Why would you even ask me that? You know. So now, I mean, I definitely think that that if you look at, it's not something that I have engaged with. I have another scholar and pastor in London who has now recently engaged in this thing called narrative preaching, you know, and the whole attempt there is in actual fact exactly that, to say, well, a lot of Jesus's teaching was story. So what are parables? You know, parables in actual fact, even the shorter ones, is like, you know, telling a story of interest. You know, it's, oh, you know, the wheat, a kernel of wheat falls to the ground, and that these were, you know, these were things that people were engaged with in everyday life. You know, they saw around them. You know, John, when John uses, particularly, he includes, you know, this metaphor of the good shepherd, you know, and so, you know, so John pulls that in where Jesus spoke about this. And again, these were things that people were like, well, you know, you know, Jesus would have been talking and there was a sheep maybe right there, or, you know, people own sheep and things like that. So he told stories that I think were just rooted in everyday life. You know, people saw this around them. And I think what it left you with, and these are just some of my thoughts in that I think about, is that everybody could relate to this. You know, everybody felt like, well, you know, this is, it was attractive. It was something that was part of their world, and they felt that they could be included in. And Jesus just had an amazing way of, you know, his life, but the way he taught and the way he lived, people followed him. You know, and even shockingly for a Jewish rabbi, women, and all these women following him. And you know, again, I just think, wow, you know, incredible. I don't know what some of your thoughts are, Temba, if that.
No, nothing. I'm not going to say much, but I think perhaps this is, you know, we're thinking, for example, we've just gone through and are still going through the whole COVID experience and so on. And in a way, I guess it's about being prophetic, but Jesus was prophetic in the sense that he began from where people were, and he drew out, you know, the prophetic, if you like, in the everyday. And I guess for me, my challenge right now is, you know, under COVID, have we got anything to say? Is there a new experience, common experience that we can tap into as we share the gospel? So it was just that idea that perhaps in our preaching, we start from too far away. Is there a way to tap into exactly what you said, what people see, what people feel, where people actually are? So that's really the thing that I've been picking up quite a lot. Thanks.
And tune in same time next week for a more extended answer on that question. You kind of, Temba, you kind of half went the place where I was, or the thing that I was going to throw at Wayne, which is I love the idea of getting in on the story. But then what do I do with the experience of, you know, then I read a lot of the Bible stories, and it's you know, it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, in a culture very different to mine. So that's not just the African experience, right? I think a lot of the planet will probably go like, hang on, this isn't my culture, or I do certainly see differences, or there are things that I don't understand. Some of it is downright weird. So how do I get in?
So I think part of it is as I said, you know, listening on Audible is helpful to me, because some of the more, you know, what I sometimes find at different parts of my life is, if I can say it like this, don't stone me, the boring bits. I just, I'm listening to large sections of scripture, and it's just pulling me into the wider story. So not every chapter is always like, oh, I can't put this down, you know, but there's something that's happening, is that it's pulling you into another world. Great analogy by Cole Barth that I could share, but it's too long. And it's pulling you into this world, which is opening up another whole worldview. And I think there's a lot that happens subconsciously at that level when we immerse ourselves in scripture. But when we read and reflect, I think there are so many amazing stories. You know, so you can read David, you can read Judges. There's so much of the story that culturally is not relatable to me. but the temptations and the fallibility, and you know, the fact of just like how these people mess up, which is just common, you know, just, I mean, it starts right at the outset, and it's like, you know, could God have found it dumber people, you know, that just, you know, they rebel, they,
Absolutely.
you know, it's really, and what comes to me is I go, well, wow, you know, he still loves us. He still wants to work with us. He's still calling people and choosing people. I mean, like, how persistent or faithful is this God, you know? And therefore, that speaks to me quite often, because that is like the whole way through, you know, whether it's David or, you know, whoever it is. I mean, David is a great one. And there's, you know, Moses is another, you know, even Abraham. I mean, these guys, how many times in Genesis I was reading, do these guys go into a foreign land and go, oh, here is my sister? I'm like, you know, seriously, you know, and the way that and that goes all the way to Jonah, you know, people trying to duck and dive and run away from God. I mean, Jonah is, you know, let's use Jonah as example. So what pastors and scholars do is they take Jonah and they argue about, you know, whether this was a real story. And you kind of go, like, has anyone found a fish that can swallow up? And you go, like, guys, you've missed the point. Read the story, get immersed in the story, and you go, oh, what a chop. He was just trying to run away from God, and like, what an idiot. And then I go, oh, hang on. You know, I've done that a couple of times. So I don't know, those are some thoughts.